There tends to be too much segregation among lawyers. Even after the trial, where we had finally laid all this out, nobody was paying attention. This public health threat was still going completely unnoticed. I think a lot of folks were thinking, they'll retract the standards for PFOA and PFOS. They did not.
Welcome to Celebrating Justice, presented by the Trial Lawyers Journal and CloudLex, the next-gen legal cloud platform built exclusively for personal injury law. Get inspired by the nation's top trial lawyers and share in the stories that shape our pursuit of justice. Follow the podcast and join our community at triallawyersjournal.com. Now here's your host, editor of TLJ and VP of Marketing at CloudLex, Chad Sands.
And take your time. This is your origin story, and I would love to hear why you wanted to become a trial lawyer.
Quite honestly, I didn't necessarily start out wanting to be a trial lawyer. I didn't even start out wanting to be a lawyer. I was thinking I was going to be an architect for a long time as a kid. And then when I went to college, I thought, I'm going to be a city planner. And when I was graduating college, I was actually got accepted into graduate school programs to get a master's in public administration and headed in that direction. And it was actually at that point in time, my dad was graduating from law school. He had been in the Air Force for 20 years and had retired and was thinking, I could do the regular retiree path and go work for a defense contractor and all that. And he said, I've always wanted to be Perry Mason. Yeah, it was his favorite show when he was growing up. And he thought, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go to law school. So he actually was going to law school when I was graduating, and he had just started out in right about the time I was thinking of going to grad school, and called me and said, hey, you ought to think about at least go take the law school admissions test. Think about law school. A law degree can give you so many more options and opportunities. And I thought, I really had never thought of that. I had really never thought about being a lawyer. And nobody in our family had ever been a lawyer. My dad was just starting out. I had no idea what lawyers would do or what that was about. But I went and took the LSAT and ended up in law school.
No way.
Yeah. So I did a bit of a switch there and went to law school. And when I was graduating in 1990, interviewed around and got an offer from a firm in Cincinnati, the Taft law firm, where I'm still at. It's been almost 36 years now. But at that point in time, they had an environmental group. Again, had no idea what that meant, what an environmental group did or what was involved. But that was one class I had in law school I thought was fairly interesting. It was environmental law, sort of overview of the different environmental rules and laws. And so I thought, I'll join that and see what that's about. So in 1990, I joined our environmental group. And at the time, a lot of what the Taft law firm was doing was actually what you'd call corporate defense, right? We were representing big companies, a lot of big chemical companies. And so really for the first 8 years of my career, I was working with these big companies, helping navigate all of these environmental laws and rules, helping them get permits, doing Superfund cleanups all over the country. And I guess was doing it well enough that by 1998, I was becoming a partner at the firm. And so it looked like my career path was pretty straightforward. I was going to be working with these big companies and really on the defense side here. And then it kind of all changed one day in 1998 when I got a call from a gentleman who identified himself as Mr. Tennant out in West Virginia and was looking for help with dying cows. And of course, that was not something I did at the time, had no idea why he was calling me. It was about to hang up the phone when he'd mentioned he'd actually gotten my name from my grandmother.
Right.
As I mentioned, my dad was in the Air Force, but so we moved around a lot. But my mom had grown up in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and her whole family was there. And that's where Mr. Tennant was calling me from. And apparently he had been talking to local lawyers, trying to get somebody to help him figure out what was going on with the cows. None of the lawyers locally wanted to get involved. So his neighbor had been on the phone with my grandmother that day who said, hey, my grandson's an environmental lawyer. He can help you. So I listened to that story. I thought, okay, well, my grandmother's somehow involved here. I better at least listen. And that telephone conversation with Mr. Tennant ended up completely changing the trajectory of my legal career. What began with that phone call turned into what became almost now 3 decades of now working on the plaintiff side and working with folks who've been injured by chemicals getting into the environment. So quite a not necessarily your direct path to trial lawyer on the plaintiff side.
Did your dad complete law school and become a lawyer?
He did. He graduated from the University of Dayton and became a prosecutor. Ended up working for the city of Dayton, Ohio for the next several decades, being a prosecutor. And, that was so different from what I was doing at Taft. At least in my early career, I'm doing a lot of these big cases that are lasting a long time. I'm digging through documents and trying to piece together, histories of what companies set waste to these sites and kind of a lot of very detailed, long, drawn out cases. And I remember going to visit him and going into court to watch him. And his day was very different. He walked into every day. He walked into court, and he'd have a stack of cases, and they'd be going through the daily communications with the judge, with the jury, the court personnel, just very different path. And he loved it and did it for decades. And it wasn't until much later that I got to do that.
Yes, actually get into the courtroom. But your dad, it sounded like your dad was in the courtroom almost every day.
Exactly.
Other than the guy who took on DuPont for over 20 years, but we'll chat about that more. I always like to ask on the podcast, what makes you unique as a trial lawyer? What makes you kind of separate yourself from everyone else?
Well, I think to some degree, I kind of came into this sort of kicking and screaming. I was always very, at least as a kid and through college and law school, sort of the one who'd sit in the back, very quiet, very, I didn't want to get up and talk. I didn't want to be the one, standing up in front of everybody. And even through my legal career, I preferred being in the background. I preferred being the one doing all the digging through the documents and putting the briefs together and doing all of that. And it wasn't until much later in my career, that I really sort of had my eyes open to this aspect of the law, standing in the courtroom in front of juries and watching, the incredibly skilled trial lawyers that we were working with, folks like Mike Papantonio and Gary Douglas, and, folks that were able to really take all of this detail, all of this stuff I've been putting together for years and years and weave it into a story.
Yes.
Being able to actually convey that to a jury in a way that they understood, and saw the big picture and got the point. And, I found that fascinating and really, it was really attracted to the whole storytelling aspect of it. And that kind of led sort of kicking and screaming into this other aspect of my career. Started working with other storytellers, filmmakers, folks putting documentaries together, working on a book, working on a feature film with Hollywood folks, just morphing into this other aspect of the law. I had sort of grown up with this idea and training that lawyers are supposed to do things a certain way. And, you stay in your lane, you're in the courtroom and you do things by filing things in briefs and you submit it to the court. And, really over the years learned there are many different ways, to be representing your clients and to really bring these stories out. And it's not just through the courtroom. It's by doing things like films and public speaking and talking with lawmakers and with storytellers. So it's been a real sort of radical transition over the years from somebody who sort of liked to stay in the back row and not speak to I'm now speaking to large groups almost every other day. So it's quite a change.
Before we get to the DuPont and the Wilbur Tennant case, could you share another story about a case that had an impact on you? And maybe it was from those early days when you were doing corporate defense, or maybe it was one of the PFOA cases or clients that, didn't get a movie made about them or isn't in a book, but you had and maybe went to trial and think about that family that you could share?
It's interesting, and you kind of step back again after, doing this now 35 plus years, and kind of look back on the history of it and look back at my early days of my career. And one of the very first trials I was involved in was actually, defending a company that was being accused of creating some pollution and noise and other problems that were impacting the local residents around the facility. And just remember back then, as the defense lawyers, we were very focused on, legally this is not required, and legally, this is not happening, and sort of not really paying as much attention to what the actual impact was to these folks and what the impact of that was. And you look back at that now, and I can see. I think it was incredibly helpful training for me, being on both sides, so to speak, over the years, because I got to learn where the companies were coming from, where the corporate defendants, where their mind was as far as the things that were of concern to them, the financial aspects, the shareholder concerns, the public relations issues, also to start to understand where these folks that are bringing the claims are coming from, why, what's going on there. And I think that was so critically important, to be able to have that experience and be able to see both sides, because it's helped tremendously over the years in being able to reach, pretty innovative and effective settlements between people on both ends of the spectrum, so to speak, understanding where both are coming from. And, I think, unfortunately, the way our legal system is set up, there tends to be too much segregation among lawyers, in my view. People that are told you have to be, quote, on one side or the other. Yeah. And, I'm a firm believer, and that is not the way. You should have a broad experience, because that helps you represent folks much better on both sides.
I talked to a lot of trial lawyers who start on the defense and then move to the plaintiff side, similar to you. It's just they don't do it while staying at the same firm. So that, I think, is something very unique about you. And that they also say that their time on the defense, brought this different skill set to when they started representing plaintiffs. So let's talk about your 30-year journey that started with this New York Times Magazine piece, The Lawyer Who Became DuPont's Worst Nightmare, and was the seed for Dark Waters. I guess, first of all, how did New York Magazine kind of come knocking on your door?
Well, that was an interesting period of time. We had spent many years fighting with DuPont and setting up this very kind of complex, kind of unique process where we were trying to have independent scientists address a general causation piece for whether people were being made sick by a chemical. And that had finally played itself out, and the folks who'd been exposed were finally sort of getting their ability to move forward with claims against DuPont for having been made sick by these chemicals. And we were finally taking the first cases to trial, where this story was being laid out to the public for the first time. And, I think finally, I was sort of naive at the time, thinking, we're finally here. We're finally getting to the point where this whole story is going to be laid out in a public courtroom. People are going to see this. And finally, the regulators are going to finally start taking action. The lawmakers, the public will become aware of this. And people will start to realize this isn't just happening here in West Virginia. This is the same chemical that's now all over the country. It's in everybody. That would get the story out. And I think what we saw was that wasn't happening. All right. That even after the trial, where we had finally laid all this out, that nobody was paying attention. This public health threat was still going completely unnoticed. And it was around that time, that I was contacted by this reporter, Nathaniel Rich, who said he wanted to do an interview, that he was working with the New York Times Magazine, I frankly was very hesitant about any of that.
As back then, maybe because you always like to stay in the background a little bit.
Exactly. And I had no idea, what angle he was coming from, whether this was going to be just a big hit job. I had no idea and was very reluctant about doing that. And I had always been told, you shouldn't be talking with media. And then it finally kind of hit me that this public health threat was still not being addressed. And, if sitting down with this guy, if we're able to maybe get the story out, maybe it's worth it, And so I kind of, took the risk, kind of bit my tongue and said, okay, I'll sit down with you, and did the interview and really had no idea what was going to transpire from that. And, what ended up being published, I was sort of blown away. He ended up putting an article together that ended up on the cover of the New York Times Magazine in 2016. And then not only that, I was just floored by the reaction. I had never before had people starting to email me, people reaching out saying, we want to know more about this. How is this happening? And what's going on? And it was sort of overwhelming. And one of the people that read that article and, reacted, was floored, saying, how is this happening, was Mark Ruffalo.
Oh, it was?
Yes, he had read that article, and at the time, he was involved in a lot of environmental issues, water issues, and he was shocked because he had never heard about any of this. And his concern was, wait a minute, how is this happening? And why is nobody talking about this? Why is it on the cover of the New York Times Magazine? Why isn't it on the cover of the New York Times?
Yes.
How do we get this story out? And it was his idea to put together a feature film to do that. And once again, I my reaction was, whoa, I'm a lawyer. I don't do, I'm not supposed to do that. I don't know anything about that. But again, sitting back and thinking about it, if this is what it would take to help get that story out, then it was worth the risk. And he was committed to doing it the right way, making sure we stuck to the facts. I mean, after all, these were real people.
Yes.
We were going to be talking about. This was a real law firm that still existed, and real, my real managing partner, and real people. And so if we were going to do it, I wanted to make sure that we were doing it with people that were going to do it the right way, and that we're going to stick to the facts. And, ended up, they did a fantastic job. But that was a bizarre, bizarre chain of events.
It sounds like it was Mark who kind of spearheaded making the movie itself. Yeah,
he was instrumental in putting all that together, putting the team together. He was the producer and became, he actually then starred in it. So he was very passionate about it.
In the movie, Wilbur kind of walks into your law firm's reception office, and you had just been announced that you had made partner. But actually, in the article, you kind of read more of how it plays out. And obviously, when you're making a movie that spans over 20 years and you're compressing it down into 2 hours, you're going to have these consolidations. And there's dozens of other examples in that, I think, throughout the movie. But I was curious, what it was like seeing your story in a movie for the first time, when you sat down in that theater or watched the DVD screener. What was it like?
A sort of surreal experience, that's for sure. I got to actually be there throughout the filming.
Right.
It was filmed here in our offices. And so I got to see it being put together. My sons got to be there, and they got to be in the background, and, cameos in our family. And so we got to see it being pieced together, which was an incredible process. And then to sit down and see it for the first time, I still remember we went to the studio, put together a screening for us in Cincinnati for just the family to see it. Mm-hmm. And I was sitting there watching it, and I still remember one of my sons, they're sitting in front of us. They turned around and, because they were growing up during this whole process. And I remember my oldest turning around saying, that's what was going on.
Right.
It's just like, oh, yeah, I get it. And, And one of the others said, Mark nailed you. So I get the feeling that he did a good job.
Did you meet with him a lot beforehand? Because actors like to kind of get into the method acting or try and capture the character. I thought he did, this excellent job of kind of creating this version of what felt real and his like mannerisms and characteristics. Like, did he spend a lot of time with you beforehand in terms of just trying to capture you as a character?
He did. He came out, we spent a lot of time at the house. He was frankly living here in Cincinnati throughout the filming, and we spent a lot of time together. Anne Hathaway was at the house, to meet with my wife, Sarah, and to see her mannerisms as well. And so we spent a lot of time together, and, we drove out to Parkersburg together and looked at the places there. And so there was a lot of time and just a tremendous guy.
Yeah, he, everyone did a great job on the film. I thought I've seen it a couple times, and in a good movie, there's always the end of Act 2, which is kind of the lowest point where all hope is lost. And it might be simple to identify that and kind of say, oh, well, here's the lowest point in this 2-hour movie. But you had to deal with this for decades. And not only you, your family, your wife, you said your kids, obviously, you had to grow up with you just spending all of this time and energy and effort. It kind of reminds me a little bit about the Russell Crowe movie, The Insider. I don't know if you remember that, but just this idea of this character in person, in real life too, that example that is risking almost everything, your health, your marriage, obviously your career at Taft, going to the partners and saying, hey, what if we become plaintiff attorneys? Was there one moment or a couple moments throughout those times where you felt like you had to walk away, and that if you did, what pulled you back in?
Yeah, I never felt like I needed to walk away, but it was incredibly stressful. You see, we captured some of that in the film. Frankly, a lot got actually cut. The film had almost an additional hour that ended up being taken out at the end. A lot of it was during that period of time, but I go into a lot more detail about that in my book too, Exposure. What was going on within the law firm, what was going on in the economy, the pressures, because you have to keep in mind a lot of this was happening. Particularly a lot of the waiting around, for, hey, what's going to happen on the science? Are we going to be able to prove that this chemical that DuPont was putting in everybody's water was actually making people sick?
Yeah.
That process started around 2006, didn't end until 2012. And I think a lot of folks forget what was going on during that period of time. We had the economic meltdown happening. And there were a lot of economic pressures, particularly, including in law firms during that period of time. And so here we are with, this kind of never ending sucking sound of, we're still paying experts at hours that we haven't billed on monitoring this process and reviewing the science and working with experts. And meanwhile, the economy is falling apart around us. And you see some of that captured in the film because there were real stresses. And it was very difficult, but I think I never really thought, oh, let's just stop. Maybe there were folks that were hoping we would, that, hey, that we've had enough. But, so many things lined up just the right way, throughout this process. One of them being when Mr. Tennant first came to our offices in 1998, the head of our environmental group, Tom Terp, actually was able to come in and sit and meet with Mr. Tennant, watch the films. So he was in part of the decision to take that case on. All right. He was there from the very first day that we decided to do it. Well, he actually became managing partner of the whole law firm later. And he was the managing partner when the economy is coming, imploding. So he was, firmly of the belief that, no, we're going to stick through this. And, I don't know if there were, if others who hadn't had a similar experience would have shared that view. It was not an easy process to live through. Throughout that, though, I kept kind of hearing in the back of my mind, somebody like Mr. Tennant, who kept saying, if people can see these facts and this evidence comes out, And we were convinced, when the scientists look at this, they're going to see the same things we saw because DuPont itself was seeing this in the documents.
Right.
That this is a problem. When we can get that story out, things will change. And so I kept hearing that in the back of my mind. If we can just stick it through, and once this information comes out, we'll see a change. And it took us a long time to get there, but Mr. Tennant was right.
Yeah. There's that scene in the movie when the discovery comes in, over 100,000 pages, all of these bankers' boxes, and you're in this dark basement or whatever, going through all of those materials. What was it kind of like to sit alone and kind of be the person who's kind of uncovering that story that was in DuPont's own, documents? And you kind of were the one who were able to write the script or, tell the story of what had gone on so long by going through all of those documents.
And now it's been millions of pages. All right. By now, I think, keep in mind, these cases have gone on, and we've had additional cases and additional discovery. It's been millions and millions of pages of documents. And I know a lot of young lawyers, they see that and they think, we don't get boxes. Well, you have to keep in mind the timing, right? I mean, this is the late 1990s. It's before everything started getting put on computers. So we would still get physical hard copy paper. And, I guess I'm a little unusual in the sense that I like going through those files. Mm-hmm. I mean, as I mentioned, when I first started out, a lot of what I was doing was going through these old files for cleanup sites across the country and trying to piece together which companies sent what waste when and, what was the history there. So I kind of enjoyed doing that. And all that difficult for me, to sit down with all of this paper. And the way I like to see things is chronologically. So I had to put everything together, and I had an incredible paralegal, Kathleen Welch, who's still working with us. It's featured in the film as well.
Yes.
Just sort of our document wizard, was able to put all this stuff together. And so that was a process that actually I found fascinating, right, going through these documents. But honestly, when I started doing that, I wasn't necessarily believing, what Mr. Tennant was saying, that, the company is hiding something and they're working in cahoots with the EPA and there's a cover up. Mm-hmm. That was not my experience, all right, working with our other clients. But when I started to actually go through these documents and started to see, that the company itself was saying these things, and, that's when everything started to change for me, when I could see the company itself, their own lawyers, their own scientists saying that this is bad stuff and, but we better not say anything about it.
Yes.
Then everything started to change, and it became a bigger task of how do we get that story out to folks so that they don't react the way I did initially when Mr. Tennant told me and just say, that can't possibly be happening and you're over exaggerating. No, this is really happening. And I think eventually the strategy we came up with was stick to the facts. Get the actual documents and the actual statements out so people can see them themselves and see that, no, this is what happened.
Mm-hmm. I have to ask you, because I think a lot of the young lawyers today would be saying, can we just scan all these pages into an AI platform and have the AI kind of go through it all and then just summarize it for us? So
no, now you're going to get me started on one of my pet peeves here. And I'll tell you, I always bring this up when I'm talking to law students at law school. And I'm a firm believer in this.
Yes.
I do not think that we would have uncovered all of this if the same case started today.
Yeah.
Because of the way the discovery rules and all have changed over the years. I mean, back when this case started in the late 1990s, you could, in my view, you could actually engage in discovery. All right. You could go look through files trying to find the information you need, and you would get the actual hard copy documents, and you'd be able to look through them yourself. If Mr. Tennant walked in my office today, and I was going to try to file a case against DuPont for what was going on, with his landfill, I would have to sit down with DuPont at the beginning of the case and come up with a list of agreed search terms for them. All right. I wouldn't just get all of their documents turned over to me, or I wouldn't be told, come go through our files. I would have to sit down and come up with agreed search terms of exactly what I was looking for. And then DuPont would only search for documents that mentioned those terms. Now, think about that. Yeah. I had no idea what chemical we were talking about, let alone that they used 8 different ways of referring to the chemical. So I would never have gotten these documents. So to me, that's very concerning, because now the discovery is almost, it's almost an oxymoron to use that word discovery. It's almost as if you have to know already what you're looking for before the process begins. So in a case like this, where you had something that was being covered up, it makes it almost impossible now.
And that's just how the states and courts have changed the kind of idea of what discovery is and the definition of that, and how the two sides need to, as I guess you said, come to an agreement beforehand, and then it can start. Where back then it was just, no, you guys have to turn everything over.
Well, you had to ask for things, within certain bounds, obviously, back in the original days now. But now, because everything shifted to these computer systems and all, you have to be much more narrow and much more focused going in.
Yes.
And again, it's fine for cases where you know exactly what you need from the other side, and you know what the words are that they use. But a case like this, where you didn't know that there was a chemical that you didn't know the name of, it makes it almost impossible now.
So you've been, again, in the trenches for this for almost 30 years. What advice do you have for other trial lawyers who are fighting their own battles? Maybe not going up against DuPont, right? But they have their own clients and cases. How do you know when the case is worth the risk? Or how do you say maybe when this one isn't mine to win?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, when I'm speaking with law students, and the concept, I guess I'd like these young folks starting out to keep in mind is, be willing to take those risks, be willing to step out of the comfort zone, so to speak. Just because we've always done things a certain way, and just because the law says you're supposed to do it this particular way, or that's the way the legal system's always handled it. As lawyers, again, going back to what my dad said, at the very beginning, that law degree gives you an opportunity to do a lot of things. And one of those things, having that law degree gives you, is the ability to create new ways of handling these legal problems and changing the legal system, improving the law. And what we see, for example, with this litigation I've been involved in with these chemicals called PFOS, forever chemical, we had to come up with new ways of dealing with that. There were evolution of new types of tort claims like medical monitoring. There were new ways of trying to address how do we prove general causation, that a chemical can cause disease. And, well, it's always been done this way with experts. Well, why don't we try doing it this way? Let's do it with scientists outside the court system. Then we come back into the court. So be willing to do that. Be willing to innovate and to say, let's try something different. And in the end, you end up, I think, improving the legal system. Excellent.
Yes. In 2024, the Biden administration kind of finalized, I guess, the first federal drinking standards for PFOS. What did that moment kind of mean for you? And not to get too political, but how do you think it went far enough? And do you have these fears of what might happen to those protections now?
Well, that's been a long process, right? And it's been an incredibly difficult process. And again, one of the reasons why I say, as lawyers, we can help improve this process. Because if you step back and look at the problem with the PFAS chemicals, and when we talk about PFAS, PFAS, that's the family of all these man-made chemicals that have a carbon-fluorine bond. All right, could be thousands in that family of PFAS, PFAS, and two of those in the family are PFOA and PFOS, all right? So it's like the banana and the orange in the fruit category, right?
Okay, yes.
And those two are the two that we have been working on, for all these years, developing the science, proving, for example, PFOA can cause disease. And so once we finally were able to show that, we were finally able to push this through the regulatory process to where, as you mentioned, something happened that I never thought I'd see in my lifetime, where the top agency in the United States is finally recognizing, what the companies had seen decades ago, that these two chemicals, PFOA and PFOS, are carcinogens. They're toxic. They are dangerous to be in our drinking water. And we are finally going to regulate those. I think I first sent my letter to EPA asking them to do that in 2001. It took us 25 years, right, to get to the point where they're actually doing it. And it's only happening because the public finally found out through the movies, through all of this, and got engaged and demanded it happen. So we finally get to that point. That was incredible, all right, to see the US EPA come out and say, we are officially going to do this now, and we're going to declare them hazardous under the Superfund law, which was another huge deal. And so that was an incredible moment to see that happen, all right? It took decades to get there. And I know there's been concern as the administration's changed. Oh, maybe that's going to get repealed. Keep in mind, this has been a problem over multiple administrations, both parties going over decades. Yeah. And what we see, I think, is finally, but what we got through all of the science that was done independently and all the stuff, all the story finally coming out was bipartisan recognition. This is a health threat to the public. It's not now seen, I think, as much of this as, this is a left-wing environmental issue. Or This is a public health issue that both sides, so to speak, now recognize. And, keep in mind, we had Bobby Kennedy Jr. was on our legal team, all right, with us on the DuPont cases. And he understands the problem with PFAS. I've been on his podcast a couple of times talking about, the PFAS problem. So it's understood this is a health threat. And so even when the new administration came in, I think a lot of folks were thinking, they'll retract the standards for PFOA and PFOS. They did not. Yeah. They reaffirmed, no, we're going to stick with those standards, which are essentially zero. All right. And the goal is zero for these chemicals in the drinking water. So I think what we see here is the science and those facts, that Mr. Tennant was talking about. If people could just see those facts for themselves, that has been effective in convincing people, including the scientific community and lawmakers, this is not a political issue. This is not a left or a right issue. It's a public health issue. And hopefully we keep going in that direction.
At CloudLex, we understand the unique demands and opportunities that personal injury law firms face every day. That's why we've built a comprehensive platform designed exclusively for personal injury law. Our seamless case management, AI engine, litigation support, and record retrieval solutions empower you at every stage, from intake through settlement and beyond, helping you stay productive, organized, and focused on achieving successful outcomes for your clients. Explore what's possible at cloudlex.com. Now, here is this episode's closing argument.
What is still troubling is these chemicals that we've been talking about, that we were dealing with in West Virginia and Ohio, 30 years ago. These are the same chemicals that are being found in the drinking water, the soil, the air, plants and animals, and in people all over the planet. And it's the same chemicals. It's the same science. Here it took us decades in the United States to finally recognize that and to finally start restricting them and phasing them out. Well, what's frustrating is when these same chemicals turn up in the water in Japan or in Australia or in Italy, you have communities there that are looking at it saying, this is something new, and gosh, I guess we got to start studying this. And what I've been trying to do is try to make sure that people understand, no, we have this history. We have this data that we should be able to use for everyone, regardless of where it's found. So that's still an ongoing effort, is to make sure people understand what they're finding now is the same stuff we've been dealing with for decades. And to hope that folks stay focused on the fact that we do have the science. Because what's still going on is you have the makers of these chemicals still actively trying to mislead the public, mislead lawmakers, trying to keep other countries from regulating these, saying, oh, we just don't know enough about the chemicals. No, we do. And we've spent many years, and we even have the top agency in the US now agreeing. So doing what we can to make sure that the rest of the folks in the world who are exposed to this understand this is all the same stuff. And we do know enough to begin moving forward and regulating it. And I think we're making progress.
You've been listening to Celebrating Justice, presented by Cloudlex and the Trial Lawyers Journal. Remember, the stories don't end here. Visit triallawyersjournal.com to become part of our community and keep the conversation going. And for a deeper dive into the tools that empower personal injury law firms, visit cloudlex.com/TLJ to learn more.